Speed must have a limit. Time must have a stop.
Both young guys. Do you think this younger generation is going to create a new world order, if you will?
Well, that would be wonderful. I've heard about new world orders many times in my life in many countries. I hope they will create a new world order, but I hope it's sound. As you know, even Germany has a lot of debt now. Britain has huge debt. Many of the European countries have built up a lot of debt in the last 20 or 30 years. And yes, it'd be wonderful if nobody has to pay the debts. And I know that there is a mindset change in Europe, but there's also lots more debt now. And I don't know how they're going to pay it off. But I don't know how the U.S., are going to pay it off either. I mean, I know this is getting worse for everybody in the world.
Tax revenue is around $4.9 trillion annually. When you look at how much the interest payments are on U.S. debt, it's around $1 trillion, and entitlement is around $4.3 trillion. This means that the debt plus entitlements exceeds the amount of revenue that the U.S. is taking in. This is unsustainable, and the interest payments are the fastest growing out of all of the U.S. budgetary spending.
On Friday, May 16th, after the market closed, Moody's Investors Service, one of the world's most influential rating agencies, downgraded the U.S. credit rating to AA1 from AAA. This sent Treasury yields up sharply on Monday morning. It hit the already weakened dollar, and it briefly rattled the stock market. So let's break down why this happened and what it means for investors. People have credit scores, and businesses and countries have credit ratings. Both help to signal how big of a risk a lender is taking when they loan money at a specific rate over a set period of time. A country with top AAA ratings should be able to borrow money more easily than one with weaker credit ratings and at some of the lowest rates available. A downgrade would signal those borrowing costs are going to rise, making it more difficult and expensive for a borrower. The U.S. budget has been exceeding its revenue for years. As of May 2025, the total debt was at $36.2 trillion. That's about $1.6 trillion more than a year ago, and almost $11 trillion more than 5 years ago. Social programs have expanded as the population has grown and aged, while elected officials have favored tax cuts. Moody's pointed to U.S. spending and interest costs that have been rising for a decade as a reason for becoming the third and final credit rating agency to cut its U.S. ratings.
U.S. debt is considered safe haven assets, and central banks across the globe use U.S. treasuries to back their balance sheets with. U.S. 10-year and U.S. 30-year are beginning to see exceedingly high interest rates, and this causes strain on the American economy. This causes interest rates for mortgages, private loans, everything to start becoming more and more expensive. There was a downtrend in the U.S. 30-year yield, and in June 2022, we saw this trend break. This is a 30-year trend that has been broken. And usually when you see the longer trends break, the more larger the move is to the upside.
I think, listen, it started with Larry Fink when he got orange-pilled, and the largest asset managers of the world said this is a real asset, in at least Bitcoin, that everyone should be part of. And lots of other companies, Invesco with us, followed suit, right? And so that was kind of round one of institutions coming in. But really it was the change of the shift of approach from the Gary Gensler SEC to this Trump administration, which has just embraced our industry. And that freed up the animal spirits, both here and abroad, right? I've had conversations with heads of large sovereign wealth funds that said, if America's buying Bitcoin, we're buying Bitcoin. And so you're seeing like the snowball is rolling downhill. The one thing that could have held it back some, at least the Bitcoin price, would have been if, Scott Bessent and his team and Congress could have really knock that deficit from 7% of GDP down towards 3%, which was his plan. Right now, it looks like it's going from 7 to 8. And, I like Scott Bessent a lot. I think he's as competent and capable as anybody. We're in a really hard position as a country. And when you have this kind of debt, and you're seeing it with long ends of interest, yield curves are selling off everywhere. The dollar's under pressure. And that all is very good for Bitcoin and crypto assets as well.
I know Mike Novogratz is not very well liked, but that is besides the point. Mike Novogratz is talking to well-established investors, including sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds are in charge of investing for the entire country. All of the excess, all of the savings that countries have, they allocate it into investments and then benefit from the yields that the sovereign wealth fund is able to acquire. Sovereign wealth funds are going to be the most conservative, yet they're allocating parts of their portfolio into Bitcoin, into crypto assets. And I am often asked, when does all this happen? When do we see a reset into crypto? And my argument is you're seeing it now. As bond yields rise, we're going to see more stress put on the American economy. Then it's going to force the Fed to intervene. They're going to have to try to control the yield curve. The higher the interest rate is on debt, the more expensive annually that this will become.
What are some of the better ideas you think he has?
Well, he's talked about, all these military alliances we have, NATO. He keeps saying we got to change all of this, and he's right. I don't know that anybody in America, much less Washington, has thought all this stuff through. More or less, it just happened. And in Washington, if something happens, 30 years later, you're still trying to deal with it because it happened once upon a time. And that is part of the U.S. problem, in my view. And Mr. Trump seems to want to make some basic changes. I hope he can, including the debt, including the taxes. It would be wonderful if we could do something about the debt in the U.S. I mean, I have two young children. The problems they're going to have in their lifetime are going to be like what the British went through in the 60s, when they had the hangover of their debt from 40 or 50 years before. And I'm afraid my kids are going to face a lot of the same consequences.
Maybe you can just elaborate on those consequences. I'm not too familiar with what happened back in the UK during the 60s.
Well, in 1925, Britain was the richest, most powerful country in the world. 50 years later, they were bankrupt. That's not a typo. 1976, the IMF had to bail out Britain because they went bankrupt. They literally couldn't pay their bills. And Britain in that period of time went through exchange controls, strict exchange controls on everybody, in fact. And it was very difficult to do anything in Britain, including have a good time, including travel, because the debt was so onerous and it had built up. Again, they were the richest country in the world 100 years ago. 50 years ago, they were the richest country in the world. And then 50 years ago, they went bankrupt.
When you look back on history and you see different nations losing the reserve currency, the citizens go through extreme hardship. They have social unrest. There's usually war associated with losing the reserve currency. It's very troubling times. It also takes decades to play out. It doesn't happen overnight. There are certain events that accelerate the process, but it doesn't happen as a flip of a switch. Now, I cannot read the future, but if we see the same pattern happening over and over again throughout history, and we look at the United States has had an empire that's lasted longer than most empires last. What's different is the technology. What's different is the technological advances all happening at the same time. We very much could see something different play out, but that's thanks to technology.
But this is a payment mechanism, and not to be confused with Bitcoin or something that has a speculative component. This puts us into a digital payment framework, the fastest rails available,
Right.
much better than the system developed in the 70s and 80s, which is slow. It takes days to clear.
So the issue, as far as I've always understood the stablecoin issue, is what is backing this stuff, and how much of it's backed by actual treasuries versus cash versus equities or something else. What does this say about all of that?
It's not going to be equities. It's going to be high quality, short-term assets, either short-term short-term U.S. treasuries or cash. I think the majority of it will be U.S. treasuries. In fact, what this will do, and the projections are by 2030, this is according to Citibank, stablecoin issuers will be the largest holders of U.S. treasuries in the world.
The Genius Act is getting ready to pass. We saw it pass the Congress, and it's in the Senate, with the Senate having majority votes, and it looks likely that it will pass. Now, in the Genius Act, stablecoin providers are going to have to back their stablecoins with U.S. treasuries. This is very advantageous for the U.S. dollar. It puts pressure on yields to bring them down. And without the Fed having to intervene, the private sector soaks up a lot of the debt that's already in the system. Nations across the world are having just as a hard time as the U.S. The U.S., you could argue, is actually one of the better debt to GDP ratios out of the world economy. Developing nations and emerging markets are seeing the worst of this problem, and it is likely that as stable coins are regulated, that we're going to see nations using U.S. dollars instead of their local currency. This is called spillover effects.
So it does matter for lots of reasons. China has built at a staggering speed. The rate at which they've built all those ships and built that Navy and built that Air Force, built that rocket force, built the hypersonics missiles, has been staggering. But they do more than that. They are also targeting our critical infrastructure right here. We know that the Chinese have infiltrated our electrical grids. There is Chinese malware on all the SCADA systems that control electric power communications. The first indication that we have that the invasion of Taiwan has started is probably that the lights go out and that the cellular network doesn't work anymore. If it did work and you could still log into your bank account, you might not actually see anything because all the records might be scrambled. It might be confusing.
This is U.S. General Douglas Wickert, and he is warning that China is preparing for an act of war. General Wickert warns about a cyber attack that if the lights were on and you checked your bank account, you may not be able to see what's in your bank account. Very interesting. We've heard Klaus Schwab as well as others speak about a cyber attack, but Douglas Wickert talks about actually losing your funds in your bank account. Now, what kind of havoc would that cause if people were unable to access their money?
And so just as an indication, it wouldn't be that easy. So if you remember that blackout in 2003 that affected the entire Northeast, and so we're talking about the Eastern Interconnect. There's 3 different regions. When you put current down wires, they tend to sag. So during the summertime, when the wind's not blowing, the electrical wires can sag. And if it turns out that there's trees there and they sag into a tree, you can actually short out a line. So that actually happened in Ohio. This little line going up to Cleveland sagged into the line. So that one came off. Was kicked offline because it shorted out. Not a big deal, pretty resilient, right? But then the next one sagged because it was carrying more current. It kicked offline, so now more current is flowing this way. That one sagged, that one sagged. Now all of this power is flowing just from there. That actually sets off a chain reaction of reactive power being out of sync with the rest of the grid and leads to a rapid domino effect of the entire grid going down. It's fairly balanced, finely balanced all the time. And if you disrupt it, the entire system can collapse. And that's exactly what happened. Ultimately, 55 million people lost power. 100 people died during this from the power loss. And it was only for a couple hours. Think about if the electrical grid goes down for 6 months, because that could happen. Now, the system's not as fragile as it was in 2003, but that was a tree. That was just a natural warm summer day. Everybody turning their air conditioners on. The line's going. Now, we don't have a lot of trees around here, but there is Chinese malware in the SCADA systems on our grid. They are in all of our critical infrastructure. Next slide.
Artificial intelligence requires twice as much energy output as we have today. So we need a 100% increase in our energy output. We're seeing a large investment in smart grids, in nuclear energy, natural gas, all of the things to make our energy output to the 100% efficiency that we need is becoming a reality, and a reality quickly. You pair this with blockchain technology, and we could see the entire birth of any type of hardware, and make sure that there is no vulnerabilities within the hardware to prevent something like this from happening again.
This is their shipbuilding capacity. They have 200, there's dozens state-owned shipyards in China. We have 4. They have 230 times the capacity. Just one shipyard in China last year alone, in 2024, built more tonnage of ships than the US did since the end of World War II. In 1 year, they built more ships than we have built by tonnage, which is what matters, than we built since the end of World War II. Next slide. And they're not just, we used to count, well, it's just cheap China technology. We've got that technological advantage like we had over the Soviets. It's not. China is now a modern force. This is a stealth frigate. They just commissioned this ship in January.
There's been a very long trend of globalization, and what we're seeing is a contraction. We're seeing the trend turn back to nationalism, bring manufacturing back to the United States. There's a trust deficit on the global stage, and we're seeing trustless technologies take hold. And this starts with sovereign wealth funds investing in Bitcoin. It starts with Bitcoin's price continuously rising. This brings interest into blockchain, into trustless technologies, and trustless technologies become the norm. Indifference is the destroyer of civilizations. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon.